Hello out there, everyone. My name is Chris, also known as CV, and welcome to my channel, The Reconverted Catholic. I'm starting a new series here called Let's Talk About Covenant. Why? Well, this topic is a crucial topic to the Christian faith, and I think could be the most important topic to discuss and resolve among Christians, especially in this day and age. With that said, let's begin. In my journey towards earning a graduate degree in theology, each class has given me a chance to plunge deep into the Bible. With the help of centuries of scholarship, several types of critical approaches to hermeneutics, a fancy way of saying interpretation, and outstanding professors who show students how to navigate this often mind-numbing, twisting and turning, ever-evolving discipline about ancient history. A couple of weeks ago, I finished yet another class, this time in Hebrew scriptures. And when I think of this class, the first day immediately comes to mind. Why? Because our professor gave us two pieces of well-founded wisdom, which not only helped my approach to the homework, but also helped boost my fascination with the Old Testament and why it is crucial to Christian belief. One, we were required to look at Scripture as best as possible through the lens of the Jewish people. We were not to use Christian goggles, so to speak, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, nor any other resource that assumes the Old Testament is a precursor to Jesus as the Messiah. After all, because Jews do not believe that Christ is the Messiah, it is necessary to understand why they have held to that belief and how their scriptures, also known as the Tanakh, support it. Number two, if we use only the Jewish lens to read and interpret Scripture, that by the end of that course I just completed, we just may end up mind blown. My professor's exact words that the Old Testament does indeed point to the Messiah we Christians know as Jesus. Sounds a bit contradictory, right? Or that maybe lessens Jewish belief. Neither is meant to be the case. Instead, I think it could be just a solution or part of a greater solution for Christians who have lost their way in their faith or have left their faith or belief altogether, or who think the church needs to change with the times, or who have trouble reconciling the often violent, disturbing stories in the Old Testament with the emphasis on love, forgiveness, and salvation in the New Testament. Whichever the case, there is a word in Christian theology that, in my opinion, doesn't get enough attention, yet is right at the center of Christian belief. That word is covenant. Think, when Christians talk about Christ, salvation, the sacraments, or Bible passages, how often does the word covenant come up in conversation? Meanwhile, I don't think I can stress enough why we must return to this word, why it could help fully restore the truth and solidarity of Christian belief from alternative worldviews, denominational divisions, and secular influences not rooted in Christian theology. Am I being a bit utopian in thinking that a single word, covenant, could help transform Christianity into one body of believers as what was intended with the founding of the Catholic Church? Possibly so. But stick with me here, because to borrow the phrase from my professor, you may just end up mind blown about why covenant is key to Christian belief and ultimately our salvation. In the first part of this series, we will explore the history of covenant and how the world itself became widely popular, starting with ancient times in Mesopotamia. Let's get started. First, a little introduction. In modern-day Western society, which includes a wide array of perspectives, both secular and religious, how would the average person today answer the questions, what is a covenant, and what is a covenant according to the Bible? Would the answer simply be, well, it's a contract between two parties? Or it's basically a promise between two parties or entities? Or didn't that Moses guy make a pact with God and then receive the Ten Commandments? Well, to understand all this better, let's first dive into the history, more about history of covenant. Learning the history of covenant starts with the Sumerians, an ancient Mesopotamian culture that existed between 3000 and 2001 BC, a time known as the Bronze Age or the 3rd millennium BC. Having inhabited their home, Sumer, eventually known as Babylonia, Sumerians were upwardly mobile, innovative people who, despite living in a desert climate with a few resources for sustainable living, became well known for the creative take on technology and inventions. These innovations would become so prevalent, they would have a major influence throughout the Near East. Example, for those who wonder how stone sculptures, the wagon wheel, engraving techniques, riveting, and even the sailboat became popular fixtures in the world, Sumerians received much of the credit. In addition to being rather technologically savvy in ancient times, Sumerians were also known for keeping detailed records of their travels throughout Mesopotamia and dealings with other cultures within a vast region, stretching from Egypt to India to most of the Mediterranean and parts of Central Asia. As such, Sumerians had extensive knowledge of the religious practices, politics, and social norms within the cultures they encountered. Sumerians were so astute in their actions with other cultures, all while balancing progressive with pragmatic approaches to their own civilization. They believed they were a chosen people who had been blessed by their god, Enki, and were elite when compared to humankind overall. Yet the Sumerians were not the only culture establishing an influence in Mesopotamia. Semitic groups such as the Akkadians and then the Babylonians, also known as Amorites, had also become prominent civilizations. This rivalry between Sumerians and Semites began as a Cold War of sorts, with the Sumerians having critical views of the Semites, particularly the Akkadians, yet both cultures willingly influencing one another, though remaining somewhat divisive. This rivalry would lead to the Akkadians exercising more control over their neighboring Sumerians, followed by the Babylonians taking over much of Mesopotamia. Because of the sweeping changes in Mesopotamia, one would think the Sumerians' influence would have been erased by other dominating cultures. Except the near opposite happened. The Semites infused Sumerian ideas and practices into Semitic life, and the Greeks and Romans would later follow suit. This led to one of the major contributions from the Sumerians, the need to document laws and legal agreements, or another way to put it, covenants. This contribution would be so influential that when examining the genealogical roots of Abraham, as central patriarch for the Hebrew people, Abraham was most likely born in Ur, an affluent city in Sumer. Therefore, it is highly possible that Abraham was familiar with Sumerian beliefs and customs, such as covenants and treaties, which were then woven into Hebrew culture. In fact, there is ample evidence that the Hebrews developed the Sumerian belief in a personal God, which evolved into the Hebrew and then the Israelite focus on one God, Yahweh. And as a quick sidebar for this and throughout this entire series, when I refer to the Jewish people, I may first refer to the Hebrews, and this is, they were referred to as Hebrews prior to Moses' covenant with God on Mount Sinai. We'll get more into that later. Which after then they were known as Israelites, or eventually known as Israelites, and then forming their home well within Israel. And then eventually known as Jews after their what's called their exile and Babylonian takeover, and we're going to get a little more into that as well. But it may sound like I'm interchanging the terms in the series, but just to kind of keep that in mind. In fact, in some points I may even say Hebrew/Israelites. But again, all of course, ultimately the Judaism, right? Jewish people. But just to give some context with that in definitions. Getting back here to the topic. It is important to note that Abraham's genealogical roots were not well unearthed until late into the 19th century. And modern scholars have debated whether Abraham, along with other patriarchs, was a fictional character. However, with advances in archaeology during the 20th century and now within the 21st century, it is still probable that Abraham did in fact exist and was directly influenced by Sumerian culture. Now, a little bit about the etymology of the word covenant, and well, when it's a word in Hebrew. So, in other words, a little bit of history behind the word and its meaning, and its relationship to Near Eastern treaties. Well, as for the term covenant itself, or its name in Hebrew, which is spelled B-E-R-I-T, it's also spelled a couple other ways, B-E-R-I-T-H, I believe, too, Bérit or Bérit. The origin of the word is not entirely clear, possibly because Bérit, as it pertains to covenant, can be applied to different contexts. The Hebrews, who spawned out of Semitic cultures, applied some of the variations. What appears certain is the Sumerians, as well as other Near Eastern customs, beliefs, and values, affected the Hebrews, and which would also show up in parallels between Near Eastern literature and Hebrew scripture. The belief in a personal God, the need for spiritual covenants, and subtle similarities between Sumerian and Hebrew stories, such as the flood story. If any of you are familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh, it looks very similar to the story we know of Noah and the flood story, but that's just one example. In general, however, the term Bérit refers to a binding ordinance or a judicial sentence. And though the etymology is not exactly clear, Bérit may trace back to the Akkadian word, it's called Beritu, B-E-R-I-T-U, which can mean to fetter or to be part of a blood relative family, or cognate root. Bérit may also have roots in the verb there's a Hebrew verb brh, again spelled brh, meaning to eat or to feed. Okay, now where are we going with all this, right? In the next part here, we are going to cover a covenant influence on the biblical patriarchs. So the purpose of, again, this part was to cover just a bit of the background history, how the idea or concept of covenant came to be, and a little bit about its word origin. So keeping that in mind, as we move to part 2, again, we're going to cover covenant influence on the biblical patriarchs. And that's where we'll really see this all come together as far as how the Hebrew people adopted covenants and formed covenants with God. And eventually, as we move on to the series, how this all ultimately leads to our covenant relationship with God through our salvation through Jesus Christ. I appreciate you watching this video. Also, I have resources below, resources I'm using for this series, also based on an article I wrote some months ago on covenant. So I'm taking some of the information from that. And of course, I want to make sure that I'm citing my information properly. So those resources will be linked, or actually will be below the comments, in the description section, I'm sorry. Well, until the next video, stay safe out there and God bless.